Hi, I'm Bob Dixon. Welcome to the Eagle Insight Podcast, your go-to source for bold and actionable leadership insights. With more than 30 years as a military officer and a strategist, I know leadership is about real impact. In this series, I sit down with top industry leaders to uncover their challenges and their success secrets. Ready to elevate your leadership? Well, hit subscribe. And if you'd like to be a guest, visit 5eaglesleadership.com/interview. Let's dive in. Hey, welcome back to the Eagle Insight Podcast. And this is where we help leaders in every industry be a little bit more awesome. Today's guest is a treat for me because he happens to be one of my advisors and one of my mentors. Dennis Cagan is a seasoned executive consultant, entrepreneur, and board director. He's been a technology CEO and a venture investor. Incredible background, creating and growing early stage technology based companies, but he also helps in other industries such as construction industry, where my other business is. He's served on over 70 for-profit corporate boards, including 10 publicly traded companies. I would also add that every time I speak with Dennis, it's like getting an education. I don't know that there's anybody who knows more about board governance than Dennis Cagan. Dennis, thank you so much for being here.
Bob, thank you for the opportunity. I enjoy it. It's always fun chatting with you.
Well, I recall that we met just a couple of years ago, and we sat down to have a 45-minute to 1 hour lunch. We ended up 3 hours later in the same restaurant going over the plans that my partner and I had for a small business venture that we were trying to get off the ground. And you were so gracious with your time. And I felt like after spending a few months of periodic meetings with you, I probably qualified for a master's degree in small business governance as opposed to small business management, which is something I was already familiar with. But the governance piece, I think, is elusive to many of us. And so I'm really, really happy that you're here to talk to my audience about something many of them don't think about. So when we talk about governance, I know you've got all of this experience. You've seen good, bad, and ugly. There's a lot of friction sometimes between boards and C-suite. In your opinion, what's the single biggest misconception that C-suite leaders have about their boards?
As a general question, the answer I would give you to that is that they don't really understand what the board's real function is, what the board can do, how much power it has, or what it can't do, how little power it has, depending on the circumstances. For instance, if the CEO owns 99% of the company, then the board actually has very little power. If the CEO owns 1% of the company, then the board or none, then the board has a lot of power. And so understanding what the board's role is, what they're there to do, how to utilize them in the best way possible for the benefit of the company, and then how to develop the relationship with the board to maximize that benefit.
I think you're spot on there. It's kind of defining the parameters of what the board is capable and authorized to do, and what is the CEO capable and authorized to do, and what is the agreement around what functions they'll serve, and what are the limits on the authorities of each of them.
So I'll give you a good example of this. If the CEO owns a large percent of the company, then he or she had to vote those board members onto the board. So he or she had a big say-so in who's on the board. If the CEO doesn't own any part of the company, then they had nothing to do with picking those directors. Probably don't even know them unless they were recruited by one of them, and so they've got an uphill job of learning more about those board members and what their interests are. So it could be that the board members are responsible to them as the owners, or they're responsible to the board.
Yeah, and it's really interesting if you're the CEO and you're a founder, and a lot of our listeners are founders and entrepreneurs, and so they may be considering standing up a board, depending on how they're structured as a company. In some cases, they're required to have a board. In some cases, it's just a good idea. And there's two different kinds of boards in general. right? Advisory boards and the boards of directors, which are fiduciaries. Can you kind of explain the difference?
Great starting question, because a lot of people don't understand the difference between those. An advisory board is really just a collection of people you want to consult with. They have no governance authority. They have no legal liability, no legal responsibilities. Most of the time, they don't get paid. They're just trying to add something to the resume, and they like you and want to help. So it's really a good way of getting a lot of free or almost free advice. But most of the people on advisory boards generally are not really at a level in their careers or experienced enough necessarily, or broadly experienced enough to be on a fiduciary board. You might find somebody that's got 3 PhDs in bioscience, but they may not be qualified to be on a board of directors, but they would be way, way qualified to be on the scientific advisory board of a company, for example. On the other hand, board of directors, their primary responsibility is oversight of the company, primarily both selecting and holding the CEO accountable, and then guiding the strategy of the company. And so an experienced CEO of any company might be a good board of directors member because of their breadth and experience, or a board should probably have a financial expert on it as they get to a size, or maybe they have a weakness in one area or another. Maybe all the founders are very domain oriented, but they are going to depend on marketing to be successful. So maybe they need a marketing person on the board. It's really a high level of expertise where judgment and experience and connections and a broader base of skills are important, because they have a liability, they have a fiduciary responsibility, okay, and a legal responsibility depending on the state's statutes for each state that they're incorporated in. And so it's a much different function. Any company legally has a board. Even if the founder started a company and they're the only one on the board, they legally do have a board. A board of advisors, they report to whoever formed them. It could be the head of marketing, it could be the CEO, it could be anybody in the company that says, "Hey, we need an advisory board. Let's put one together." But the board of directors is responsible to the owners of the company.
I think when early on we were discussing in our venture the idea of making a board of advisors and a board of directors, and I asked you what kind of people do we need on our board, and the first thing you said was, well, you got to find somebody to shore up your weaknesses. Like, what do you not know? Find somebody who's an expert in that and put them on the board. Now, whether or not they're in an advisor position or in a director position is not as important as having those skill sets that you and your core team aren't experts at.
Exactly. I had a client a number of years ago in Atlanta that was a trucking company. It was $1 billion company, and it had been put together by acquiring a lot of smaller. It was a roll up in the trucking industry, and the CEO hired me to come to a board meeting to review something with the board. But I walked in the board meeting, and there's 6 people on one side of the table that are all the previous owners of 6 trucking companies that they had acquired. And the other side of the table was 6 investment bankers that had put the deals together. And then there was the CEO who owned the company, and his daughter, who was a talent agent from Hollywood. Okay, and the reason he invited me to the meeting was that their CTO was going to be presenting a proposal to the board that they develop their own mobile app for their drivers. And the CEO felt that there was nobody on his board that knew how to turn on an iPad.
Yeah, I think, there's a great example of, okay, we don't have the breadth of experience on our board that we actually need. So yeah, I appreciate that advice early on as we started shoring up those areas that we were not experts at. There's also a decision of whether or not you invite somebody to be part of your advisory board versus the fiduciary board. And a lot of that has to do with how much they're going to be involved and how much authority you want to give them. And I still recall one of the first board members that we recruited, and he said, well, do you want me on the advisory board or do you want me on the board of directors? Because my level of crankiness goes way up if I'm a fiduciary. And I laughed about that, but I could hear you explaining to me in a previous conversation to that was you kind of need somebody cranky on the board that's going to hold you accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's what I said earlier about being a fiduciary board has a lot more stringent requirements for judgment and breadth of experience. And also, there are for any company, the company has a culture and it has a certain character, a certain personality, if you will. And so I tell people that for any particular board position, there might be 100 people that are really, really well qualified to be on that board. But out of that 100, there may only be 1 or 2 that are suitable to be on that board because they may not be a good fit. And so you can have somebody that, just to put it bluntly, you can have somebody that's a jerk on your board of advisors because you're going to just talk to them from time to time and get advice. They're not going to have to interact with the rest of the board or the rest of your company. They're really just there for expert advice. They're an advisor. Okay? You do not want somebody like that on your board of directors who's there to make everybody uncomfortable, upset everybody, hijack the meeting, etc.
Yeah, I think that's great advice as well. And if you are a leader, if you're the CEO or in the C-suite and you're involved in the selecting of the board, then you should have that culture check. You've got to have the litmus test. Does this person meet the personality of and the values of the company that we're trying to build here? Sometimes you don't get a choice because you've been hired as a CEO and you're going to have to deal with the board that you're given. So that's a little different situation there. And I think it's a challenge for a lot of particularly first-time CEOs. So what kind of advice would you give them, a first-time CEO who didn't get to select the board that he's going to have to deal with? What should they do?
The path diverges a bit, but you got to start with, is that CEO getting a board seat or not?
Good question.
CEO can either be on the board or not. Those are dramatically different. If he's high enough level and has negotiated a board seat as part of his deal, that's one thing. If he's not, and he's just strict, and as many cases, he's just reporting to the board, he's not on the board, then that's a whole different story. But some of the similarities between those two situations are, first of all, if he's being hired in either case, he should want to meet the board members before he takes the job. Okay, best practices for the board would be to individually interview the CEO. Sometimes the board does it in a group. Sometimes they do some individuals. Sometimes it's just the governance and nominating committee of the board that interviews the CEO, then presents maybe just their resume to the board. Those are not what I consider best practices. Best practices would be for every board member to interview, for the CEO to interview with every board member one-on-one, so they can ask what questions they want. The CEO is not trying to dodge back between people, and they can get a gauge of each other's what is important to them, what their concerns are, what their personality is, so they can make a good judgment of that fit. So the CEO, it will tell him a lot about the board, her a lot about the board, whether the board wants to interview them or not, and how the board interviews them or not. So that's their first picture of what kind of board it's going to be.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting to think about. Like, okay, you can understand if they want to they want to interview you as a group, you're going to get a very different picture because it's going to be like a Senate confirmation hearing, right?
Yes.
Where people are posturing and they may be like, well, I want to ask a more insightful question than the other board member, or they're going to try to steer it. You may get a glimpse into the dynamics there, but you may just get confused because you're not seeing the true person when
Yeah,
they're in that group
and
setting.
as the CEO, that's not your choice, but it does give you an indication of that particular board
Right.
and their level of sophistication, their adherence to best practices. They're going to do their normal practices. They're not trying to do any more than they normally do, but that will give you a good picture of how it works. Now, one advantage to doing it, if you are in a group situation, then you can quickly judge the group dynamics. But I far prefer individual interviews. It gives the board a better idea of who the CEO is, and it definitely gives the CEO a better idea how the board is. Then the next question is, who's the chairman of the board? Who's leading the board? Is in a CEO job? Who is their main conduit to the board going to be? If they're on the board, then that sort of takes that question away because they're participating in the board. It's still important whether if there's a chairman or if there's a chairman and a presiding director or whoever's sort of the lead or leads of the board, that's important, particularly if you're not on the board. If you are on the board, then it's also important, but it's a little bit different. So all those things are something that the CEO needs to consider. It's always helpful and almost never done that you would read the bylaws of the company you're thinking of joining. Okay, nobody ever does that, but that tells you basically what the board can do and what it can't do, where the power lies, and those do vary from state to state, and obviously from company to company. If you're taking over a big company, you want to know what the board is allowed to do or not, particularly if you're not on it.
Oh my gosh, that is such a critical point, Dennis. And I used to say in the military that most of our organizations are run on urban legend and myth. They're like, oh, I read this in a regulation somewhere, and I'm applying it the way I was taught to apply it. And then you go look up the regulation, and it has nothing to do with the way they're applying it. I'm betting that you've seen examples of people who thought something was in their authority on a board, or a CEO thought that they had the authority, but nobody read the bylaws. And for years, they've been getting away with doing something they had no authority to do.
I have seen the reciprocal of that multiple times in cases where a CEO was told by multiple attorneys that they absolutely could not do something. No, you cannot do it. There's no way you can do it unless they approve it or do this or that or the other thing. Multiple times, multiple attorneys. And they've retained me and I've come in. And in most cases, by the time I get done looking at everything, I'll say, okay, send this email to the board and it's done. You don't have to do anything else. And the attorney said, no, illegally you can't, because nobody really read the governance documents. Nobody really understood what the CEO could do, what the board could or couldn't do, etc., what had already been done. And so even attorneys in those situations didn't dig deep enough into what was into the documentation of the company to understand what could or couldn't be done.
Yeah, I bet you've got a bunch of examples of where people haven't really dived down into the detailed level, I think, of the governance documents. And this is something that you helped us with as we established our company, of okay, the devil's in the details. And sure, you can download a chat GPT version of your organizational documents. But there is probably some things in there, some loopholes and some gaps, or there are things that are going to be outright dangerous to you as a business owner, that could be laying in those documents. Do you got any examples of people
So,
who've been burnt by that?
yeah, one thing I would say, flashing alert. do not ask AI, Chat GPT in particular, but do not ask AI to draft governance documents. I have tried, and the results are abysmal. I can tell you that. Okay? Because what they leave out and what they misconstrue, what it leaves out, or what I keep saying they, and what it misconstrues is enormous. So that's a warning. Now, you might be able to use them to give you a quick evaluation of what's in something, but to develop something, no.
Yeah, I would definitely shy away from that.
Now I forgot your original question because I got hung up.
Well, I was just wondering, like, there's some examples of little gotchas that might be in your organization.
I'll give you one of my favorite examples. There's a client that was referred to me. He was in New Hampshire. Somebody he knew in St. Louis referred him, and that guy had been referred to me by somebody in Dallas. Anyway, talked to me. He was a CEO of a company. The company was very profitable, family owned, had been started by his father. He was the CEO. The father passed away. All of the shares, all of the outstanding shares of the company, long story short, were in several different trusts for his family. The mother was a trustee of the trust, and then there were other trustees. And the CEO his name was Paul. He had a brother. The brother had nothing to do with the company, but he did get paid because it was family owned. So he was being paid dividends out of the company, but Paul was running the company. Paul did not own a single share, nor did the brother. All the shares were in the trust. If the mother died, the trust would be liquidated and the company would go 50-50 to Paul and his brother. Paul was concerned that his brother had nothing to do with running the company. He didn't want to get into an argument with his brother over how to run the company and paralyze the company. So Paul wanted one more share, just so that when it gets divided 50-50, he would have one extra share and a controlling vote. His mother didn't want to do it. He went to 2 law firms, as I indicated earlier. No, Paul, there's nothing you can do unless the trust either gives you a share or sells you a share. There's nothing you can do. So Paul retained me. I sent him an email. I said, okay, I've reviewed everything, Paul. Send this email to your mother and the other trustees, and you now own outright, legally, 33.3% of the company today, and there's nothing they can do about it. Completely legal, and you don't even have to pay a nickel.
Oh my gosh! Well, there must have been some doozy of a loophole in there somewhere.
There was a for me, it was a flashing red light, but apparently 2 law firms missed it. Okay, so now the end of the story is Paul freaked him out being able to accomplish that, but he did take the email to his mother and they did negotiate something that was satisfactory. But what everybody missed was when the company had been formed, probably 50 years before that, 50 years of documents from the beginning of the company in the 70s, they had authorized 300 shares, but the company had only issued 200 shares. That was what was in the trust. There were 100 shares left in the company's treasury that were unissued. According to the bylaws, the board of directors can issue those shares to anybody it wants, period. Paul was the only member of the board of directors.
There you go.
All he needed was a resolution and an email issuing himself up to 100 shares, which was what was in the treasury. Thereby, he would own a third of the company. Okay, he would have had a tax. He wouldn't have had to pay for them, but he would have had a tax bill on a third of the value of the company. But he could have just issued himself 1 share, paid his $50 in taxes or whatever it was, and be done with it. So that's like a glaring red light. There's 100 shares in the treasury. You need shareholder approval to authorize more shares, but you do not need shareholder approval to issue shares that were already authorized.
There you go. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why you have to pay attention to your governance documents and don't leave it up to a template that you downloaded or, heaven forbid, ChatGPT. If you're not having somebody who really understands governance review your governance documents, it was 50 years later that this came to play. And I think a lot of us, as we're building companies from scratch, as entrepreneurs often do, take it for granted. Yeah, I have to file with the state, organizational consent. Yeah. And we don't pay enough attention to that. We don't imagine the scenarios that might play out someday. And it's all fine when we're all in a room going, okay, we're going to build this company together. But 30 years later, things change. And so the letter of the law is going to be incredibly important. So having an expert look at that stuff is, I would say, critical, particularly for young companies.
And I have to add, just from experience, that your attorney is not always the only person you should be getting advice from on these particular things, because attorneys tend to have certain boilerplate documents and certain standardized approaches that they use for things, and they're not often looking at the extraneous varieties of issues that are more curated for your situation. You certainly want good legal advice, but just because they're an attorney doesn't mean they're qualified to give you business advice.
That is absolutely true. And I often hear people, when people claim expertise because of the number of years they've been doing something, it always makes me suspicious. And when I hear a lawyer say, I have been, doing these documents for 30 years, I'm like, okay, but if you're giving the same document to people year after year after year, that's not 30 years of experience. That's like 1 year of experience repeated 30 times. So I always cringe when I hear that. And I have to think about, you could have been doing it wrong for 30 years. And yes, you have a lot of experience, but it doesn't make you right.
I had a situation one time where I did some documents that had to be filed with the state. It was the state of Texas in this case, and I did the documents, and I gave them to the company's legal counsel to review, and an associate did the review first time. The documents came back, and it was like 3 pages, and the associate on Word tracking had deleted 2 pages of my document.
Oh, no.
Literally, read out 2 pages gone. Okay? And so I said, what are you doing? They said, well, you can't do that in this document. I said, yes, you can. They said, no, you cannot legally submit this document like that. And I said, yes, you can. So we escalated it to the managing partner of the law firm. And the managing partner first said, no, he's right, you can't do that. And then I talked with him for a few minutes and said, well, okay, well, you can do it, but nobody ever does it that way. So I get on Google, and in less than 5 minutes, I send him 3 Fortune 100 companies that have all done it exactly that way.
We get in these mental traps that the way that we're used to seeing it is the right way, or the only way, or the preferred way. And if we all had that mentality, we would still be stuck in, I don't know, the dark ages. It's the ability to take chances, or to make changes, or to consider another path that might be more advantageous to us. That's where progress comes from.
I gave a talk one time at a private company governance conference in Washington, D.C., and there were 35 speakers. And after the conference, somebody said, well, what did you think of the other speakers? And I said, I thought that they were all really good. I said that none of them, in my opinion, none of them said anything wrong. I said, but I did not necessarily agree with everything they said, but nothing was wrong. And so there are a variety of approaches that can be taken in these situations. And so
Yeah.
if it's not tailored specifically to the needs, both the personal needs of the owners of the company and the needs of management and the industry they're in and regulatory and all kinds of considerations, one size could fit all, but it's not the best solution for
Right.
everybody.
Right. Right. So I guess the lesson here is, if you're forming your company, pay very close attention about how you form it from a governance documentation standpoint. And then second, if you were not part of the formation of the company, if you are taking over either as a board member or a leader that has to interact with the board, you should read those organizational documents. You should understand the governance, the authorities, and how people are supposed to interact with each other.
Yes, and if you don't understand something, then maybe that's the time to use AI to give you a summary of what that means.
Sure, absolutely. Or to consult with an advisor. And if you happen to be lucky enough to have a governance advisor on your board, then you have that ability to do that and say, oh, Dennis, I don't understand this. Can you explain it to me? And then after you explain it to me, I have to ask you again, can you explain it to me like I'm a 6-year-old because I didn't understand your answer? But I'm getting better at that.
So, knowing that you can edit this out if you want to, I will tell you an amusing story quickly. Just before this call, I was granted access by a brand new client to their cloud storage, Google Docs, or whatever. Anyway, so I went on there and I've gotten access to all the corporate information that I want to download to review and look at and whatnot. Well, in there was a file on Cagan Co. on me. And it had our contract and my invoice and some other stuff in there. Well, in there also was a document that was an analysis of why the CEO should hire me. And when I looked at the document, it was clearly done, and it is an AI company, by the way. It's a woman entrepreneur, and it's an AI company. But it was clearly an AI output document that summarized why I was a good consultant for her to hire. So she had clearly loaded in all my stuff and got a report back on me. I haven't read the whole thing yet, but it was clearly done by AI. I've never seen that before.
Wow. Now that brings up the idea that as an aspiring C-suite executive, for those out there, and I do meet with a lot of military veterans as they're transitioning out of the military, and many of them would love to be in the upper echelon of small, medium-sized companies. And maybe they should put all of their credentials into AI and ask it, why you should hire me, whether or not I would be a good hire for this company.
Yeah, I'm hoping maybe I can use some of it for my own marketing. I don't know.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. So we've learned that we have to pay attention to the governance. We have to understand the limits of our authorities and the freedom that we might have with respect to the board if we're the CEO. That I think makes it much easier to interact with them. But interaction with your board as a senior leader in a company is really more about personalities. Yes, there's a letter of the law. Yes, there's governance documents, but it does come down to personalities. And it does come down to how transparent you are, how forthright you are with the board. And I'm guessing that you have seen friction between boards and C-suite leaders before. Is that true?
Oh yeah, and I mean, friction is on a scale, but at the end of the scale, there's termination. So it's meaningful.
It is absolutely. So
Actually, at the end of the scale, it can be termination and legal action, to put it bluntly.
That's true. Absolutely. So do you have any examples of, say, where a board's intervention has altered the course of a company?
It's hard to tell because without the board's intervention, you don't know what the course of the company would have been.
Fair enough.
So that's a little bit harder to say whether whether the board said steer right and you missed the iceberg or not. But I know many cases where the board didn't intervene and they hit the iceberg. And we talked a little bit about this earlier. And some of the cases that your audience may be the most, at least anecdotally, familiar with include things like WorldCom, Enron, WeWork, Wells Fargo, and I could go on and on. If they read in the business section of any newspaper, they'll recognize the implosion of most of them. I mean, Wells Fargo survived, and then every day you read about companies who have gone south, and if they're public companies, they went south to some degree because the board didn't intervene.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Generally, it's not a proactive decision on the part of a board to do something really stupid. Generally, it's a concession and a lack of action, a lack of a decision on the board that allowed the CEO or whoever was responsible to steer the company into that iceberg. So it's more a case where the board doesn't act that the company gets into trouble. Now, obviously, if the board is full of insiders, because this brings up another key concept, if the board is full of insiders and they're drinking their own Kool-Aid, so okay, I will give you okay, I will. I said I might not have any anecdotes about this, but I'll give you one. I was the interim CEO one time of a company for 4 months, and the company was publicly traded company in good standing, and it had a very, very famous majority owner, which is one of the largest, probably the single largest investor in internet companies in the history of the world. They owned a majority of this company. Okay. And they brought me in to run the company for 4 months. And during the 4 months, the market cap of the company went from 100 million to $1 billion. And I hired a CEO, which was I was there to turn the company around, move it, do some other things, and then hire a permanent CEO. So I hired a permanent CEO, and I went back to being on the board. And somebody asked me for some advice a few years ago, and I said, I'm going to tell you what I would do in this situation you're asking me about, but I want you to know how much it cost me to learn this lesson. So the guy was buying me a sandwich. I said, so for the price of the sandwich, but I want you to know what I paid to learn this lesson. I said, I paid $26 million out of my pocket to learn this. He said, oh my gosh. He said, well, what should I do? I said, sell, because I didn't.
Oh.
So when I stepped down as CEO, the stock that I had gotten was worth $26 million in the money. I didn't sell a share. A few years, because nobody else was selling. We all thought this was going to go to the moon. We thought the board, great board, but oh no, let's keep going. We got a new CEO. Let's go, blah, blah, blah. We sold the company a few years later to a company that ended up being acquired by Google, but we sold it for $7 million. Nobody made a dime.
So you bring up a really good point, and it goes back to what I said when I approached our first board member, and he said the level of crankiness goes up if I'm a fiduciary. There's danger in having a board full of and a C-suite full of optimists.
Yep.
It's very easy for us to just breathe in our own exhaust and believe our own stories about our market growth and our ability to handle any crises. And if there's not somebody on in your circle, in your board of advisors, or better yet, on your board of directors, who's going to say, hey, hold on here, fellas. This isn't all going to be beer and Skittles. There's going to be some bumps in the road, and we need to talk about that. And we need to be able to protect ourselves and mitigate some of the risks.
I can give you anecdotally. I don't know if these companies had a board or not, but I can tell you that I've read accounts of Ray Kroc when he founded McDonald's. People told him he was crazy. Don't do it. Blah, 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 blah. He went against everybody's advice and McDonald's. Colonel Sanders, no, what are you, crazy? Nobody's going to buy, whatever. There's plenty of examples of entrepreneurs. Okay, the founder Smith, the founder of FedEx. Okay, so they thought his business plan was terrible when he was at Harvard, but he left Harvard, I think it was Harvard, and started FedEx. Okay, so there's plenty of accounts where the advisors, whether they were board or not, I don't know, but where the advisors said, no, that's a stupid idea. So to a certain degree, the entrepreneur has to go with their gut. But if you've handpicked or you've joined a board with a good breadth and depth of expertise, and all of them are saying, no, that's a stupid idea, at least it takes you back a step to rethink it. No, I really believe in this. I'm going to go ahead and do it.
I think that's really important to reiterate right there. There are entrepreneurs that said, torpedoes be damned, we're going forward. I know everybody else, but I'm changing the world here. And some of them have. We also know that about 98% of the companies that have that mentality fail within the first 2 years. So it's a cautionary tale.
Yes.
But here I think is an important point, that having that grumpy guy who's not the eternal optimist on your board he's going to start poking holes in my plan. And I'm going to paint this rosy picture about, ever increasing hockey stick type charts. And he's going to go, oh, but what about this? What about that? What about this? And I can ignore him and say, no, I've got a great idea and the experts don't know what they're talking about. Or I could say, that's a good point. Here's how I'm mitigating that risk. And I can go into it as a solid business plan that's been through a grinder with my board. And at the end of the day, they're going to say, well, okay, you've answered all of my questions, or nope, you still have this residual risk. And that's the risk that I know I'm taking. But I'm not just going in at Pollyannish and saying, it's always going to be 10x multiples. It's always going to be growth, growth, growth.
You're talking around. There's a principle that it's not like the new principle, because it's now a couple of decades old, but it's still considered new, about boards, which is nose in, fingers out.
Yeah.
And so the board's there to oversee, to ask questions, to drill down, to press, to challenge management, but they're not there to get their fingers inside. And I have on one of my boards, I recruited a guy to one of my boards 20 years ago. He's been on my board for 20 years. This is a company that I co-founded many years ago. And when he joined my board, he resigned from the board of 4 Fortune 100 companies. He was formerly the president of Caltech. Okay? And being on 4 big, including like General Motors, I'm talking big companies. And when we're in a discussion on a subject, and there's other people on the board are really, unbelievable as well, but every once in a while he'll raise his hand. And he's 90 some years old. So, and sharp as a tack, he'll raise his hand and say, can I ask a question? Stupid question.
Yeah.
And everybody on the board, all top people on the board, shut up. They want to hear what his stupid question is.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's asking the questions, making management or the CEO in this case, have to think through the answer to that question. Thinking through the answer to that question may bring them to the same conclusion they had before, but it may bring them to a different conclusion. That's the second primary job of the board. The first one being to hold the CEO accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you put good people on your board, if you get the choice, if you don't have great people on your board and you're not getting the advice you need, then forming a board of advisors, or at least you don't even have to formalize it as a board of advisors, but taking on advisors to shore up your weaknesses so that they challenge you and challenge your thinking. Because if you're the only one doing the thinking, you're probably missing something. You've got these blind spots around you, and that's what those advisors are there for.
And I think, and again, if I overtalk something, you can take it out. But this is if somebody has a company and they're thinking of whether they want to have a board or not. Okay, if you're going to put all your relatives and your buddies from the country club and your own attorney and all this close circle of people who may or may not be willing to tell you the truth, if you're going to put them on the board, don't bother.
Right. Right.
You want independent directors that have expertise, as you indicated, in areas that you don't, that are going to be candid, that are smart enough to ask you questions. They're there to help you. The biggest reason for not forming a board in a company is because you don't really give a hoot what anybody else thinks. If you're that arrogant and you don't care what anybody thinks, then do not waste your time.
Well, there's nothing more frustrating to an advisor than to listen to their advice and ignore it completely. And I do have a client that has a little sign on he's got a little sticky note near his desk, and he says, "If all else fails, do what Bob told you to do in the first place."
I love that.
But he's also one of my favorite clients. But I think the idea of shoring up your blind spots, it's just like when you're driving your car. There's places around your car you can't see. We have mitigated some of that risk with technology, and as you're driving your organization, you can mitigate that risk with great advisors and a good relationship with your board. And something else occurred to me that in the military, I don't know if they do this anymore, but we used to be required periodically to do a 360-degree evaluation. And so you're getting feedback from peers and subordinates and seniors, and you had to select a number of all three of those categories. And I watched as most people would pick their friends and pick the people that like them and pick their favorite subordinates to give them feedback. And I always thought that was really mismanaged. I thought, and I personally did this, is I would ask for feedback from people who I didn't get along with. And I would ask, a peer who was ultra competitive, who was always trying to outdo me. I would get their feedback, and I would get a subordinate that I pissed off, and I would get their feedback. And I just thought I would get something a little bit more honest, and it would start to show me how I am being perceived by others. And it would help me shore up some blind spots that I got. And I got some fantastic feedback that I had to make some adjustments to my leadership style based on that. I feel like the board can serve a lot of that purpose, but not if, as you say, I'm getting my cousin Eddie on there and my two fraternity brothers and hey, let's throw my daughter on just in case because, she looks good on the website. I don't think that's going to be helpful to you in terms of getting the feedback that you need to hear as a leader.
No, absolutely. And, I spent all day with a client yesterday interviewing 3 family members out of the 5 family members that own this particular company, because there's some contention going on within the family. One of the family members is a son who runs the company, and I'm trying to get all of the feelings, aspirations, concerns, and everything from these 3 family members who can sway the controlling vote of the family.
Mm-hmm.
And it's looking like the best solution to their family issue is to create a board of directors with all 5 of the family members on and 4 independent board members. Okay? So now you've got 4 independent board members that were elected by the family to be on the board. So now anything that comes up, everybody gets their say-so, but a vote on it is going to be balanced by 4 completely independent board members.
Well, as long as they that those weren't the independent board members are actually independent.
Yeah, no, and of course the proposal, of course, is that I will present the independent board members for their vote. So
there you go.
Yeah.
Let's shore up our weaknesses and our blind spots. That's the way to put together a board. So, Dennis, what do you see coming up in the future here? If we look ahead, what are the trends in like the kind of C-suite to board relationships, or how are boards evolving? What's happening in the world in the next couple of years?
Well, there's a number of things that are happening, particularly over, I would say, the last decade. The one thing that most people will be familiar with that's a continuing trend at the highest level is the increasing trend towards separating the CEO from the chairman job.
Mm.
Traditionally, particularly in a lot of the big companies, the chairman and the CEO were always the same. So separating that job and having an independent chairman is a continuing trend. And if we have time, I'll tell you a quick story about that in a minute. But the second one is, again, along similar lines, is an increasing proportion of independent directors. Okay, more and more companies are adding more and more independent directors. So if it's a big company, a lot of times, particularly in private companies, if it was a big private company, they may have put the former CEO on the board.
Right.
Well, he's not an employee anymore, but he's the former this or the former that. And one of my stories is about that. But anyway, so no, real independent directors. And you see the exchanges, New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ and others, now they have requirements for the minimum number of independent directors.
Oh, wow. That's good.
And so it's a legal requirement to be listed on the exchange that you have a majority independent directors, things like that. The next thing I would say is boards in general are getting better educated on governance. The members are educating themselves more. A lot of people that want to join boards are getting better educated before they even are put on boards. So there's more there. On the other side of the coin, and obviously in part, but only in part, on the part of the new administration in Washington, there is less emphasis on diversity, except for diversity of experience, diversity of background, diversity, in other words, not focusing on some of the things that were the primary focus in gender, ethnicity, things like that. They're focusing on real business qualifications, obviously still looking for a diverse background. I mean, I myself have brought people onto boards out of a number of qualified candidates where they were all equal. There were many cases where I preferred a diverse board member because of the other influence it brought on the board. The last trend that comes to mind is traditionally boards have looked for, and everybody can identify with this. Boards, the people that got on big boards mostly were former CEOs or former politicians or some other person of notoriety, but mostly boards were former CEOs, and very little concern for the thing we talked about in the very beginning, the backgrounds of people, where their expertise was. And this was more prevalent in bigger companies. Now they're changing and they're looking for board members that have different backgrounds. One of the trends a few years ago was towards bringing younger people on boards, particularly younger people that came out of tech companies, adding to big boards like Walmart and companies like that. And so traditionally CEOs, board members that had domain experience in exactly the same business that you're in, which you may already have plenty of expertise in that business, and finance. Those were the three most common characteristics that companies look for board members. Now, they're beginning to look for people who have expertise in technology, in marketing. Technology and marketing are arguably the two biggest differentiators in business today, globally.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And to differentiate your company is your branding and your use of technology. And then the third area where they're starting to recognize the value of having board members with expertise in that area is human capital. And so
absolutely, having a human capital strategy and having somebody who can inform that on your board is going to be incredibly valuable.
Recruiting, retention, management, culture.
For many of us that came out of the operations side of the world to become CEOs, it's kind of an afterthought. Like, yeah, we'll hire somebody. Like, no, it's not like that. It's a strategic question, and there are some great people out there who can help you with that. So I think there's something to be said about preparing yourself. You mentioned that people are preparing themselves. They're educating themselves before serving on a board. And CEOs should be preparing themselves for dealing with a board, or anybody in a C-suite or senior leadership position that's going to have to deal with a board is not just educating yourself on boards in general, but on the specifics of that company, the organizational documents, et cetera. One of the ways that I would recommend for people to prepare themselves for either being on a board or dealing with a board is get yourself over to Amazon.com and pick up a copy of The Board of Directors for Private Enterprise. That's published in 2017 by my guest, Dennis Cagan, who is the expert on boards of directors for private organizations and a wealth of knowledge. Dennis, how does the audience find you when they want to talk to you about this in greater detail?
They can go on LinkedIn or Google and just put in Dennis Cagan, and then they will get screen after screen after screen of stuff. And my email is just dennis@caganco, CAGANCO.com. That's my website. And I'm as far as your audience is concerned, they can consider themselves my mentees now, and they can call me if they got any questions.
Well, Dennis, you have been a tremendous help to me and my team as we grow our company. But more than that, you're a great member of our community. We're glad that you're a transplant from the great state of Texas to the greater state of Florida. And I am proud to call you a friend. Thank you so much for spending your time and, more importantly, your wisdom with us. And this has been fun.
Bob, thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.